We turn our attention now to the rise of hip-hop culture across the 1980s, and most specifically to rap music that is a part of that hip-hop culture. Hip-hop culture arises out of New York's African-American and Latino communities during getting rolling during the mid-1970s, but being pretty much a regional culture that you'd kind of have to go to the Bronx in New York to really kind of see. A little bit interestingly, in a parallel to CBGBs happening in New York at the same time. Remember, we said the same thing about that, you know, that New York punk scene, unless you actually were there and had actually gone into CBGBs or Max's Kansas City and sort of gone and seen those groups, you wouldn't otherwise have known very much about it being there. And it was the same way with hip-hop culture. There were several components to hip-hop culture. There was eventually the rap music and the music making, the house parties. We'll talk about that in just a second. There was the graffiti, which maybe got the most attention outside of New York because the graffiti was very colorful and interestingly and well done. And so you put the graffiti you would see like on the side of one of the New York the cars in the New York subway trains, you know. And kids would sneak into the train yard overnight and they would put their name in their own sort of distinctive style, painted onto the side of the train, and when the train would come out in the morning and travel around the city, you would see that there all day. And of course then the train company guys would go and, you know, paint back over it, and the kids would sneak back in and do it again and again. Over and over it went. This graffiti, although of course certainly it was illegal to do, became part of the culture and a kind of an expression. Breakdancing was also a part of it, and an approach to fashion and to dress became distinctively hip-hop. So when we talk about rap, we're really talking about the music that comes out of this hip-hop culture. And early rap, it turns out, really arises from neighborhood parties. And you know, when we were talking about music in the 1970s, we talked about the contributions of Jamaica and reggae music. And at that time, I was telling you that reggae music came out of a tradition in Jamaica that sort of started with the sound system men and various kinds of things that went on in Jamaica, and then eventually sort of morphed into reggae, and then we talked about Eric Clapton and Bob Marley and all that. Well, another way that the same tradition makes its way into American and rock history generally is through this sound system man thing, which moved literally in the person of DJ Kool Herc, moved from Jamaica to the United States. In fact, Herc was only about 12 years old when his family moved from Jamaica to the Bronx. But he'd been to these Jamaican parties where a DJ would come along, you know, with a truck that had speakers and sound system and turntable and all that kind of thing, would play these records. And, you know, like anybody does at a party when they're trying to get the party going, you get on the microphone and you talk and you encourage the people. You know, you got your hip things that you say to kind of, you know, get things going, you know, and you talk to people, you encourage them to dance. This is any band that's ever played a wedding knows that if you want to get people dancing and having a good time, you've got to kind of encourage them along. And this is a lot of what went on at these Jamaican parties. And so this is what Kool Herc started to do in the Bronx. He started to put together these parties first in his own apartment, but then it got so well populated and so many people were coming that they had to move it out into the park. You know, he would just plug all the gear into the whatever electric outlets were available out in the park through the power shed or whatever, and you know, just sort of play this music. And you know, he would talk over the music and encourage the crowd, and people had a great time with it. In the course of doing that, he developed a couple of things. First, the idea of the MC, which Herc himself did for a little bit. And then he brought in Coco LaRock to sort of specialize, because he started to get busier and busier with actually spinning the records themselves. We'll talk about that, the techniques involved with that in just a minute. Kool Herc was important in encouraging young men and women, boys and girls, to do a particular kind of dancing, which eventually ended up being called break dancing. And so he called them as break boys, break girls, or B-boys and B-girls. And this break dancing thing really started to catch on at the end of the 70s. Maybe if you were watching the news or one of those sort of news magazine kinds of shows, they would do a thing about this crazy new dancing kids were doing in New York and the Bronx. They called it break dancing. And very quickly spread to suburbs all over the country where people were trying to imitate what they saw on television. But some of the technical innovations that Kool Herc is usually credited with, the most important of them is this idea of prolonging the breaks in certain records. So there would be places in a recording where it would break down to just a very great sounding beat. But in the course of the tune, that section would maybe only last 8 bars, 16 measures, something like that. But it was so cool, what he wanted to be able to do is have people just dance over that section. Now, in the days before digital sampling, where you could just sort of sample those 8 bars and just play it over and over again, how are you going to do that? Because after the 8 bars are gone or the 16 bars are gone, that section's gone. What are you going to do? So here's what Kool Herc does. He gets 2 turntables, he gets 2 copies of the same record. He plays that section on this turntable. When he gets to the end of it, he quickly moves the sound over to the other turntable where it's queued up to do exactly that same thing, and then he keeps going back between the two. So through a very analog kind of procedure, he's actually extending this break thing to maybe 5 minutes, and then sort of talking over top of it, you know, sort of encouraging the crowd, this kind of thing. Now, if you're in a band, you can do that really quite easily. You just get to that point in the tune, and everybody in the band says, we'll just stretch this section, and bands would do that kind of thing all the time at parties, you know, stop at that bit and get the dances going. But if you're a DJ and you don't have that kind of control, you've got to deal with the music that you've already got. And so what Kool Herc did was develop this technique of extending and prolonging these breaks by using 2 records. Well, there were 2 people who were very much influenced or part of this whole scene along with Kool Herc in the early days. The first one is Grandmaster Flash, who interestingly was born in Barbados, but as a kid ended up in the Bronx in New York. And Grandmaster Flash very much admired Herc and picked up on his technique of using the 2 turntables and being able to sort of prolong the breaks, and Grandmaster Flash had training in electronics, and so he knew how to create a mixing board that would pan between the 2 turntables in a way that Herc had not yet done. He also perfected this technique of punch phrasing, where you would grab just the horn hit from a particular tune and insert that. So if you could get the break extended, then you could punch in various things. So what they're really doing is a kind of analog sampling. That is, sampling by using actual turntables and records, something that we would now do and have been able to do for many years, simply by getting digital samples and just juxtaposing them to each other. Lots of times when you go to see a DJ now, they're working on a computer or a laptop. But these days, you actually had to use the real records and be able to manipulate this stuff. And so there was a lot of room for error, and it required great skill to be able to pull this off with the kind of mastery that people like Herc and Grandmaster Flash did. Another thing that Grandmaster Flash is often given credit for is scratching, which is moving the record against the needle in a backward direction, the kind of thing you were always told never to do or it would ruin the needle, you know, back in the 70s when you bought expensive stereos. But these guys did it, and it gets this great kind of scratching sound, right? It turns out that most rap historians would say that it wasn't Grandmaster Flash who developed that. It was a guy by the name of Grand Wizard Theodore. But Grandmaster Flash really perfected it and made it a signature part of his style, making the DJ himself not so much the MC or the rapper, but the DJ himself, a kind of a specialized kind of gig where there was a kind of a technical proficiency. You had a kind of a virtuosity in being able to take these received sounds and transform them into new sounds that were perhaps more effective in a dance context than they might have been otherwise. But all of this coming out of a party none of this at first was recorded. It was all done real, live, and in real time. The only way you could know about it was to go to one of these events. There were no rap records in the not until really to the late 1970s you get the first rap recordings. It was really thought of as a kind of a live thing that you really had to be there to see it happening. A third person that's involved in this situation is a guy by the name of Afrika Bambaataa, who was in fact born in the Bronx, unlike the other 2 guys. He had been a former gang leader, but his idea was to try to use hip-hop culture and rap music as a way of bringing youth together to get them out of gang-related activities and violence and get them involved in something, much more wholesome, the way like in some communities, communities will do with midnight basketball. It's something to get kids involved in something that's a little bit more wholesome, to give them something to do, to give them a way to kind of spend that energy that you have when you're a teenager and not do it in a way that's going to get them into any kind of trouble. So he establishes a group called the Universal Zulu Nation, where he uses rap as a way of reforming youth. And Bambaataa is often credited with inventing the term hip-hop. This is sort of like Alan Freed in rock and roll. Although hip-hop had been in the vernacular, Bambaataa sort of put his trademark on the idea of hip-hop as a description of this entire culture. So now we talk for a minute about how it is this, what was essentially a live thing happening at parties and this kind of thing in the Bronx, turns into something on recording. Because in the early days, all of this stuff, nobody ever thought that there could be a rap record, because the whole idea of doing this was to really take records that were already recorded and create something new in a live context. But it so happens that a woman by the name of Sylvia Robinson was attending a party in Harlem, and she heard some kids singing or chanting verses over a song by Chic, Good Times, which had been a sort of a disco hit earlier for Chic. And they were just playing the record and in rhythm sort of chanting these lyrics over top of it that they'd made up. And she thought it was actually kind of catchy. And so from the point of view of somebody who had experience in the music business, Sylvia Robinson had been part of the duo Mickey and Sylvia. In 1958, they had a number 11 hit with Love is Strange. If you've never heard Mickey and Sylvia's Love is Strange, you need to find it and listen to it. It's an interesting piece of music. It was a number 1 R&B hit. Mickey and Sylvia were kind of not exactly an imitation of Les Paul and Mary Ford, but they were very much influenced by the success of Les Paul and Mary Ford. She came back in 1973 with a number 3 hit called Pillow Talk. So she'd been involved in the business, and so she decided that she would use her music business knowledge and understanding and connections to bring together a record, almost a novelty record, where they would do this. These kids would get some musicians to do this rapping over Chic's Good Times. So I'm not quite sure whether they used the original rhythm tracks to the Chic record. I think they re-recorded rhythm tracks just like the ones that are on the Chic record, and then had this rapping go on over top of it. She called the group the Sugar Hill Gang, and the name of the tune, released in 1979, was Rapper's Delight, kind of a novelty record. The first real rap record on record was a number 4 R&B hit, number 36 on the pop charts, and it really showed that you could translate, at least in some ways, or at least for one song, this rap experience into a record that could then be sold and you didn't have to actually be at the party. Following up on that, on Mercury Records, we get Curtis Blow in 1980 with The Breaks Part 1, a number 4 R&B hit. And then Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five on Sugar Hill Records again with The Message from 1982. Only got to number 62 in the pop charts, but number 4 on the R&B charts. And this one really dealt a little bit more with some of the downside of urban life and some of the kinds of problems and that can happen in urban life in the black community. Anyway, what these records proved was that the rap experience could translate to vinyl. So by 1982, we know there's a possibility, and it will take somebody stepping in to actually take that possibility and turn it into something more than just a small regional niche market. So we'll talk about how rap crosses over into the mainstream in the next lecture.